The biggest challenge is always to come up with something that looks realistic, really. We're pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable on screen by... There's a very educated viewing public out there now. I think the more and more sophisticated effects get, the more the viewing public expect.
Definitely part of creating the reality of this piece was putting the actors directly in the center of the action. So what we were doing is enhancing the danger and bringing, the violence and the sort of insanity of the situation right down into the faces of these actors who otherwise would have had to be stunt people.
We had to create very large screen CG effects that would have to stand up to great close-up scrutiny, because that was the feeling we wanted to convey. Is this very in-your-face sort of effect that is going to be really, you almost feel it.
We got a Black Hawk down, we got a Black Hawk down.
The capability is extraordinary. And I think in this instance it helped me, tremendously. But I think there's also, you've got to make sure that everything the way you're designing it doesn't look larger than life. So when it starts to look larger than life, then you start to not believe it. So you start to lose the jeopardy.
One of the things we were facing is the huge difference between fantastical effects, the type of things that you'd often do in visual effects where you're simulating something that simply can't exist in real life, therefore is impossible to film and it needs to come from the computer. And this idea of reality-based effects, things that were simply too dangerous or impractical to shoot at the time when production was going on, and then we're called upon to basically go in and edit reality and bring in the necessary storytelling points that they couldn't capture on the day. And I think the viewer is more harshly critical of reality effects than fantastical effects. Because when you see a spaceship up on screen or a huge monster, you know that, what you're looking at is coming from someone's imagination. It doesn't represent anything you've seen in real life, and you have no basis to judge it against other than whether or not does it look real or computery. But when you look at a reality-based effect, which is some very small manipulation of reality that you're not expecting to see, then the slightest thing that's off-kilter that cues the eye to the work being manipulated, I think instantly breaks the viewer's suspension of disbelief.
We had to create effects that were totally believable and in some ways almost had a heightened sense of realism, so that we're able to capture the drama and what really happened out there. And on this film in particular, this revolved around the actual crashing of the helicopters.
This is 6-1, I'm hit.
The original tack on approaching the crashing helicopter was based on more of an in-camera effect. And I think Neil, Cobbold and Ridley had discussed ways of creating this, perhaps before we'd been part of the conversation.
So the tail was here. Where's Slav? The tail goes there. If the camera was here, low, you'll have the whole tail pass over your head.
John, bring the answer crash box here.
His methodology, which has worked very well on several of the shots in the sequence, was to reconstruct a full-size Black Hawk helicopter, and using a complicated wire rig which is suspended by an 80-foot crane, actually crash this full-size helicopter for real. Which, if you can do something for real, then do it for real. I mean, I stand by that as well. If you can create something that looks realistic in camera, then that's fantastic.
With the helicopter crash, we're using the same 160-ton crane, and then we're straining 2 wires over about 150 metres down to a point in the ground. Then we've got a lightweight helicopter that we suspend from the cables, and then we basically release it, and it comes down the wires, crashes through a fountain, and as it crashes through the fountain, we release it from the wires, hits the ground, and that's what gives us the impact of the crash.
So our work on those shots was to basically remove the crane and the wire rig by shooting and using clean backgrounds that we would then paint away the wires, and then add the element that couldn't be done for real, which was the rotor blades turning. So those were always going to be done in CG. The biggest limitation with the setup, unfortunately, was that it couldn't spin, the helicopter couldn't spin, and as the edit developed after the practical effects had been shot, it became apparent that really the helicopter had to be spinning to work in sequence and in the continuity of the order of events. And this is really where we sort of reanimated a lot of those shots that perhaps were originally intended to be done using the full-size mock-up. To achieve all of this, basically, we produced a series of animatics for Pietro, whereby using background plates that I shot in Morocco, we put our CG helicopter into those background plates. So we had full-length takes of a crashing helicopter. These different camera views could then be edited together by Pietro in a sequence, so we could establish the sequence and the order of events and which camera views he wanted to use of the crashing helicopters. And at this point we were just using a simply shaded CG model. But that allowed us to determine the speed of the helicopter, the position, the distance it travelled through the shot, where it ultimately ended up and its size. Once we'd established all of that and the edit itself was locked on this sequence, we were then able to take it to the next stage, where we then start applying our highly detailed CG model. The computer-generated Black Hawk is a model, but it exists in the computer, and it's a highly detailed version of the real thing that we have at a high resolution in the computer, because we're also comparing our CG model in scenes where you see a real helicopter. It has to be good enough to actually stand up to scrutiny, and because of this we had to go into a lot of detail, and the texturing, we had to pay a lot of reference to the real things, and the way that the actual, even down to the way that the oil stains on the body appeared, and the slight riveting on the actual detail and the way that the panels are constructed. We really paid a lot of attention to that, and obviously used the real reference of the filmed footage of the real helicopters, and that's the best way of sort of matching something, is to refer to the real thing. We had 4 real Black Hawks on location in Morocco, which we were able to photograph and film and use for textures as well as just lighting reference. And we had to construct the helicopter, obviously, of course, and to do that we had to try and find sources basically on how to build a Black Hawk helicopter, and one person found some plans on the internet, but most of what we did came from 2 manuals basically, which are a bit like car manuals. And it's literally sort of, it's everything you wanted to ever know about a Black Hawk helicopter. And based on those and some measurements that we took from the real things, we reconstructed a CGI version of the real thing. And then the final stage, really, to sort of make the thing work and be convincing, was to create real practical effects, which I decided to do as a scaled miniature shoot. But in order to generate the effects, I thought the best way of perhaps doing this was to actually use something that mimicked the helicopter itself. So we got hold of a body shell of a 6th scale Black Hawk that the special effects guys had built, and we actually constructed a model mover. So what we did is we programmed the model mover with the animations from our CG, and therefore were able to recreate, using this 6th scale miniature, our crashing helicopter, dressing a false floor with the dust and the sand and the debris and the rocks, and shot this as a series of elements on blue screen and black screen, and then we're able to actually pull those elements off using keying and soft mapping techniques and layer those with the 3D animations, and therefore created a real convincing practical effect that we needed, that had to be sort of realistic looking. And hopefully the sequence works so well that you don't know what's a real helicopter, what's a CG helicopter, and what's a model helicopter that's been crashed on the location. It's a combination of different techniques, really. In the 2 sequences where Walcott and Durant, who are the 2 pilots of the 2 helicopters that go down, get hit, once they're hit in the tail rotor and lose control of their tail rotor, that they get sent into an uncontrollable spin, basically. And the pilots were able to recreate that effect of a spinning helicopter for real, that we were able to film again, part of the events involve once the tail gets hit by the RPG, obviously there's a fire goes on inside the back of the sort of gearbox, and this emits quite a lot of black smoke, and we weren't, for obvious reasons, able to put anything onto the helicopter in the way of smoke canisters or anything that might hinder visibility or flying ability of the real helicopters. So those were digital effects that we added later to the real helicopters in terms of adding bits of damage to the tailpiece, removing the real rotors, and then adding CG smoke and fire to the tails.
One of the things we realized right away when we started animating the helicopters was that it was very easy to make a helicopter that looked like it was moving wrong. And we'd thought, since we hadn't done a lot of this sort of thing with CG helicopters before, that a helicopter would just basically fly around like a bug, and anything you did would look correct. But once you actually get it up there on the screen and it looks like the real thing, its movement can very quickly cue the viewer to it being an artificial element. Helicopters basically hang from their propeller, and their movements are controlled by the shifting of weight beneath that swash plate, the central control mechanism. So it's important for us to duplicate that so that as a helicopter tipped forward, you'd see the various portions of the move that you were always seeing and really not paying much attention to with the real helicopters, as the blades go forward and then the body sort of tilts back to accommodate that, and each one of those things happens one after another in fairly quick succession. When you put them all together, they generate this very real sense of a helicopter flying around. And if you didn't do that, which is what we tried initially, what you got was this feeling of a toy. And especially when we were dealing with things in the distance, it didn't take much for them not to look real. So we found that by duplicating reality wherever possible, especially in the movements and the jointing system of the helicopter, we were able to get things that moved in a much more realistic manner.
Some of the challenges on this film involve creating effects that we hadn't actually worked on before. I mean, dust is something that you see quite often, but it's still, I've seen it many times and it doesn't look convincing or realistic in CG, and we wanted to develop a way of creating absolutely believable dust and debris and particles, which, just to explain why we were doing that, there's a sort of strong story point in the film where these helicopters are so enormous, and the downdraft from the actual helicopters themselves is so immense that once they go into position to drop the Rangers, who fast rope out of the helicopters from about 60 feet, they literally create a dust storm underneath them that gets so intense that you get a 50, 60 foot cloud of dust, whereby visibility goes to zero. So we had to control the dust on the set, which involved wet downs and making the ground damp to actually limit the amount of dust and allow the cinematographers to actually film the action. That then meant that we had sequences where there was a lot of dust and other sequences where there was none. And one particular moment, which is quite crucial in the film, when the character Blackburn falls out of the helicopter and is sort of lost in the middle of this dust storm. Unfortunately, during this sequence, there was no dust, so the whole idea of conveying the fact that this whirlwind was around them and they were lost from their other comrades wasn't conveyed, so we had to develop this photorealistic way of creating dust and sort of debris, newspaper being blown around, which we've done for several shots during the sequence. We have a lot of handheld shots whereby we had to track those camera moves and then apply those camera moves in CG to create the dust and the debris, and would then work in the live action plate. And that all has to match and work with the other shots where there was real practical dust, and that was quite a challenge in itself.
The mill had tackled most of these shots, and we were given the unenviable task of duplicating the effect another company had done for one very big, wide, dramatic shot. We took a huge number of different approaches to this because we were trying to duplicate a lot of someone else's R&D in a fairly short period of time, and we kept running up against a brick wall to get the feeling of, dust washing through this square where it actually interacted with the buildings, where there was little bits of paper and plastic bags flying around, took us quite some time to actually nail, and it was, I think, one intensive 48-hour period with Nathan, the senior visual effects supervisor, actually sitting on an inferno for that entire period, working with elements constantly streaming up from the 3D department before we actually got it. We were able to turn that shot around at the very last minute of the show. One of the challenges that we faced was we needed to generate a huge amount of damage to the streets of Mogadishu in a very short period of time because our post-production schedule was quite compressed. So we developed a tool that would allow the artist to basically drag a crosshair across the screen as though he was aiming a virtual gun, and the computer would calculate damage based on the firing rate of the gun and just explode things randomly following the line of fire of the crosshair. We used that to choreograph a lot of the action scenes. It involved a lot of bullets flying to and fro. The system ended up having quite a video game feel to it, and I have to admit it was pretty fun, and we did spend a couple of hours just playing around blowing things up and seeing what the effects would be. But the end result was that we were able to choreograph these scenes quickly and generate a huge amount of chaos in a fairly short period of time just by playing virtual sniper and running the crosshairs across the walls of buildings. Part of creating the reality of this piece was putting the actors directly in the center of the action. So you can take your featured performers, your Josh Hartnett's and Ewan McGregor's, who you probably don't want to blow walls right beside them so that they're sprayed with little chunks of concrete and flying metal and ricocheting bullets, and allowing us to drop them right there, an inch away from a big CG explosion or effects that we'd shoot separately. In picking up elements, we did a day of element shooting where we shot hundreds of exploding concrete blocks and bullet hits and sparks and shell casings. We were able to take all of these separate elements and on the computer, as different layers, stick them literally right on top of the actors with the plates that Ridley had shot over in Morocco. Assault sequence at the end of the film, they had shot real little birds firing blanks, strafing down these long city blocks, synced with pyrotechnic explosions, spark explosions, and there were definitely some issues with timing, and overall the look that they had was a bit sparse because the entire rooftop was peppered with extras and actors pretending to shoot up at the little birds. And of course there were no tracers either, because tracers are actually quite dangerous, nasty things in real life. So one of our challenges there was to go in and add tracers to the little birds, connect them to the explosions that weren't necessarily timed correctly to how they were firing, and then add enough extra damage that we would actually believe that these little birds were disassembling these structures and knocking them almost flat over the series of the strafing run. The reason that we often went with a live element as opposed to a CG element was that level of detail that you get out of something shot live, especially something, a dynamic explosive event like a bullet hit on a concrete block that's shot at high speed, means that you can orchestrate that on the computer. You can rotate it, shift it in 3D, you can treat it as a 3D element, though it is a 2D piece of film, and position that wherever you want, and it's always going to have that characteristic chaotic, marvelous, random real-life feel to it. We often orchestrated things on the computer where we generate with a 3D particle system a choreography for a scene that would show us where the bullets were going to hit, who was shooting whom. Then when it comes to the finishing touches of actually putting on that explosive event on the concrete walls, we'd go back and we'd find the elements that we'd actually shot and use those to substitute in for the original particle generated effect, because we felt that you could sense the realness.
The largest crowds we had to generate were for the opening scenes at the grain distribution points. They had about 1,000 to 2,000 real extras on set, and we've probably added another 5,000 or 6,000. To create digital people, we have to start with movement, and to create the movement, we use a system called motion capture, and that involved us recording and capturing the movement of people walking, running, jogging, sort of ambling, strolling, various different movements that we would need to apply to our CG characters. So once we've established what the movements they're going to be performing and where they're going to be, we then have to sort of put the CG character in there, and that person has to be photographically real looking person. And we do that by using texture maps that we generate from real people. So we photograph the real Somali extras, and then we literally stick them onto our CG characters. So we probably build 20 or 30 different body types. We then scale the body types, so we have variation in scale and size. We vary the walk cycles, the speed they're walking. And we also then use the basic costumes and colour correct them, so we can generate thousands of extras. So out of 20 or 30 extras, we create thousands basically, and the variation gives you the believability.
I think one of the most interesting challenges of what we do is a lot of my job is something that pretty much anyone can do. You look at the computer screen, you stand behind the artists that are doing this work, and you look at the screen and you say, that doesn't look right. Now, anybody can do that because it's something that just looks wrong. The trick is knowing how to fix that, and so much of this actually lies on the shoulders of the artists. But that's the interesting challenge of visual effects, is everybody can see a bad visual effect. The second it comes up on screen, there's no way to hide it. The reason it's bad is because it stands out. Once you do your work perfectly, then it disappears into the background and nobody sees it. Especially on a film like this, where our work involves not creating something that wasn't there in the first place, but enhancing something that already was.
Ultimately, it's not a film where you go and say, oh, look at the effects on that film. It's ultimately a film where you go and you come out saying, wow, I've seen a great film. And it's only afterwards you start thinking, well, there must have been some effects in there because, that helicopter really did crash and those people did get thrown out and there was a guy there, seemed to be thrown to the ground. And it's all those effects that we add, and we can bring an extra dimension to the film and that make it real and believable, yet don't really stick out as effects. And I think that's always going to be the ultimate compliment.